Leavenworth exposed. What life is really like inside America's oldest federal prison. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe because this case only gets darker from here, and trust me, by the end you're going to question everything you thought you knew about justice inside America's most infamous prison. The sirens echoed off the limestone walls just before dawn. At 4:17 a.m., floodlights snapped on across the yard of the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. Guards rushed toward cell block C as alarms screamed through the corridors. In a place built to contain the country's most dangerous federal inmates, chaos was almost unheard of. But that morning something was very wrong. Correctional Officer Daniel Mercer had been found unconscious outside cell 214. His keys were missing. The steel door to the cell stood slightly ajar. Inside, inmate Marcus Holloway, serving 25 years for organized racketeering, was gone. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken bars. No shattered locks. Just an empty bunk and a folded prison blanket placed neatly at the foot of the bed. It was impossible. Leavenworth wasn't just old, it was legendary. Built in 1903, its thick stone walls had withstood riots, escape attempts, and generations of hardened criminals. No one had successfully vanished from inside its maximum security wing in nearly 3 decades. Until now. Warden Thomas Kessler arrived within minutes, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. "Lock down the entire compound," he ordered. "Nobody moves. Nobody breathes without my approval." By 5 a.m. the FBI had been notified. Special Agent Rebecca Vaughn stepped through the prison gates just as the sun began to rise over the Kansas River. Vaughn wasn't new to high-risk fugitives, but something about this case unsettled her immediately. Marcus Holloway wasn't just another inmate. Before his conviction, he had operated a sophisticated financial crime network stretching across the U.S. and Europe. Millions of dollars had vanished through shell corporations and offshore accounts. Prosecutors had argued he was the quiet architect behind multiple organized crime syndicates. But Holloway had never once lost his composure during trial. He had smiled when sentenced. "See you sooner than you think," he had whispered to a courtroom reporter as marshals led him away. Now he was gone. Security footage from cell block C was reviewed frame by frame. At 3:58 a.m., Officer Mercer conducted routine checks. At 4:02 a.m. the cameras glitched for exactly 90 seconds. 90 seconds. When the feed resumed, Mercer was lying on the ground and Holloway's cell door was already open. "There's no way that's random," Vaughn said quietly. The prison's internal IT supervisor swore the system had been inspected just 2 days prior. No prior malfunctions. No reported tampering. Then came the first twist. A search of Officer Mercer's locker revealed a prepaid cell phone wrapped in plastic and hidden inside his spare boots. The call log showed a single outgoing call at 3:51 a.m., 11 minutes before the cameras failed. The number traced back to a disposable device purchased in Kansas City the previous week. Mercer regained consciousness hours later in the infirmary. Disoriented. Confused. He insisted he remembered nothing after turning the corner near cell 214. Medical reports showed mild blunt force trauma to the back of his head. Enough to knock him out. Not enough to cause permanent damage. But there was something else. Under Mercer's fingernails, forensic techs found traces of limestone dust mixed with industrial lubricant. Substances commonly used in the prison's maintenance tunnels. Maintenance tunnels that hadn't been officially used in over 20 years. Vaughn requested blueprints of the original 1903 structure. Many sections had been sealed off decades ago during renovations. As engineers began cross-referencing old maps with current layouts, another discovery surfaced. Inside Holloway's cell, carved faintly into the underside of his metal bunk, was a series of numbers. Coordinates. When entered into a mapping system, they pointed not to Kansas, but to a private marina on the coast of Portugal. Europe. Vaughn felt the weight of it settle in her chest. This wasn't an impulsive escape. It was coordinated. International. And Holloway hadn't done it alone. But the most chilling discovery came late that evening. When technicians restored a fragment of corrupted footage from the 90-second blackout, they saw something no one expected. The camera hadn't glitched. It had been manually overridden, from inside the prison's central control room. And only 3 people had access to that system. One of them was Warden Thomas Kessler. But when they opened the locked door to the control room to question him, what they found changed everything. The control room door wasn't just locked. It was barricaded from the inside. When Agent Rebecca Vaughn forced it open with 2 correctional officers at her side, the monitors were still glowing in the dim light. Coffee steamed on the console. A chair lay overturned near the main security terminal. But Warden Thomas Kessler was gone. There were no broken windows. No visible signs of struggle. Just the faint smell of sweat and something metallic lingering in the air. On the central screen, frozen mid-frame, was the 90-second blackout from earlier that morning. Except now it wasn't black. It showed someone seated at the override terminal. The figure wore a standard-issue guard jacket. The camera angle captured only the side of the face, partially obscured by shadow. But the profile was unmistakable. Warden Kessler. And he wasn't alone. A second figure stood just outside the frame, handing him something, what looked like a small flash drive. Vaughn leaned closer. "Enhance the reflection in the glass," she ordered. Forensics zoomed into the faint glare on the monitor screen. In the warped reflection, a face appeared for a split second. It wasn't Holloway. It was someone in a suit. Not prison staff. Not law enforcement. An outsider. The timestamp showed 3:59 a.m., 1 minute before the blackout. "Run facial recognition," Vaughn said. Within hours the results came back. The man in the reflection matched an Interpol watchlist entry. Victor Hallberg, a Swedish national suspected of laundering funds for multiple European crime syndicates. He had never been formally charged. He was known for staying several steps removed from any direct criminal act. And according to travel records, Hallberg had entered the United States 3 days earlier. Under a diplomatic business visa. The investigation widened instantly. Airport surveillance placed Hallberg in Kansas City the night before the escape. Rental car data showed his vehicle parked less than a mile from the prison perimeter between 2:30 a.m. and 5 a.m. Meanwhile, Warden Kessler's official vehicle remained in its assigned parking space inside the prison gates. Which meant one of two things. Either Kessler had orchestrated the escape from within, or someone had forced him to. By late afternoon, a search team entered the abandoned maintenance tunnels beneath Cell Block C. The air was thick with dust and decades of neglect. Flashlights cut through darkness as agents moved carefully through the narrow passageways. 20 yards in they found it. A section of recently disturbed stone. Behind it, a concealed opening just wide enough for a man to crawl through. And beyond that, fresh footprints leading toward an old drainage exit that connected to the riverbank outside the prison walls. The tunnel had been mapped in the original 1903 blueprints, but sealed during renovations in the 1970s. Someone had reopened it from the inside. This took months, one engineer muttered. Maybe longer. Which meant Holloway's escape hadn't been spontaneous. It had been engineered. But here was the part that didn't make sense. Marcus Holloway had been in solitary confinement for the past 6 weeks following a minor altercation. No outside work assignments. No access to tools. Limited contact with other inmates. So how had he coordinated a multi-layered international breakout from a locked cell? The answer arrived in the form of a financial alert. An offshore account in Lisbon, previously dormant, had just transferred $4.8 million into a shell corporation registered in Delaware. The corporation's listed director? Thomas Kessler. Vaughn stared at the screen in disbelief. Kessler had no known history of financial trouble. 27 years in corrections. Clean record. No disciplinary actions. But $4.8 million wasn't a coincidence. By nightfall, a nationwide alert was issued for both Marcus Holloway and Warden Thomas Kessler. Then the situation escalated. At 11:42 p.m., Kansas State Police responded to a vehicle fire on a rural highway 30 miles east of Leavenworth. The car was registered to a rental agency in Kansas City. Inside the burned-out shell, they found a body in the driver's seat. Dental records confirmed it was Victor Hallberg. Execution style. No identification left behind. No weapon recovered. Just a single object placed carefully on the dashboard. A folded photograph. When Vaughn unfolded it, her breath caught. It was a surveillance image taken inside the prison cafeteria 2 weeks earlier. Marcus Holloway sat at a table alone. Across from him, barely visible in the background, stood Agent Rebecca Vaughn. Watching him. Someone had circled her face in red ink. And written 2 words beneath it. "You're late." Vaughn felt the message settle like ice in her veins. This wasn't just an escape. It was a warning. And if Holloway had orchestrated the death of an international financier within hours of fleeing a maximum security prison, then he wasn't running. He was advancing. But the most terrifying realization came seconds later, when her phone vibrated with an incoming call from a restricted number. She answered. A calm, familiar voice spoke softly on the other end. "Agent Vaughn, you should have looked closer at the blueprints." The line went dead. And in that moment she understood something horrifying. Marcus Holloway had never left Leavenworth. Agent Rebecca Vaughn didn't move for several seconds after the call ended. Marcus Holloway had never left Leavenworth. The words echoed in her mind as she stared at the prison's towering limestone walls. If he hadn't escaped, then everything, the tunnels, the marina coordinates, the burned car in Kansas, had been theater. A distraction on an international scale. Vaughn turned to her team. Full sweep. Every sealed section. Every crawl space. Tear this place apart. By midnight, the penitentiary was in total lockdown again. Inmates were confined. Guards were rotated and individually questioned. Engineers reopened architectural archives dating back to 1903. And that was when they found it. An anomaly in the blueprints. During a renovation in 1987, a structural reinforcement had been added beneath the old chapel, officially documented as a foundation repair. But the dimensions didn't align. The reinforced section was larger than necessary. Too large. Vaughn stood inside the abandoned chapel as dust swirled in the beam of her flashlight. Beneath the faded wooden pews, beneath the cracked altar stone, was hollow space. Concrete that sounded wrong when tapped. "Bring me a drill," she said. When the slab was breached, cold air rushed out from below. And there it was. A hidden chamber. Not ancient. Not improvised. Engineered. Inside were fresh supplies. Water, packaged food, medical kits, battery packs. A laptop sat on a folding table, still powered on. Surveillance feeds from inside the prison streamed across the screen. Holloway hadn't fled. He had relocated. A figure shifted in the shadows. "Careful," came a calm voice. Marcus Holloway stepped forward, hands raised, expression composed as ever. He looked cleaner than any man hiding underground should. "You found the room faster than I expected," he said. Armed agents surrounded him instantly. Vaughn stepped closer, her weapon steady. "This ends now." Holloway smiled faintly. "It already ended. You're just catching up." He didn't resist as cuffs were secured around his wrists. But something about his calm unsettled her. "You orchestrated an international manhunt," Vaughn said. "You staged a financial trail, a murder, a tunnel escape. Why?" Holloway tilted his head slightly. "Because sometimes the only way to expose corruption is to make it undeniable." Within hours, Warden Thomas Kessler was located at a motel outside Topeka. He didn't run. He didn't fight. And under interrogation he broke. The offshore transfer hadn't been payment for an escape. It had been evidence. 4 years, funds allocated to prison infrastructure had been siphoned into private accounts. Shell companies tied to state contractors, international brokers, and yes, high-ranking officials. The 1987 foundation repair had been a money laundering operation disguised as construction. Holloway had discovered it by accident while reviewing legal paperwork tied to his own case. Names overlapped. Financial trails intersected. He had realized something critical. The same network that prosecuted him was profiting from corruption inside the system. So he built a spectacle. The blackout. The tunnels. The European connection. The staged death of Victor Hallberg, who investigators would later discover had been cooperating with federal authorities under immunity. Hallberg wasn't murdered. The burned body had been misidentified, dental records swapped using falsified files planted in the system. It was all manipulation. A performance designed to force federal oversight, international involvement, and independent audits. By the time Holloway was escorted back into a reinforced cell, this time under 24-hour surveillance, the investigation had expanded beyond Kansas. 3 state contractors were arrested within a week. 2 federal procurement officials resigned. Offshore accounts were frozen. The story exploded across American and European media. Headlines called Holloway a mastermind, a whistleblower, a criminal genius. But Vaughn wasn't celebrating. She visited him one last time before his transfer to a supermax facility in Colorado. "You risked lives," she said through the reinforced glass. "You destabilized a federal institution." Holloway met her gaze calmly. "And now the corruption is public. Would they have listened otherwise?" Vaughn didn't answer. As she stood to leave, he added quietly, "You were right about one thing, Agent. I never intended to leave Leavenworth." She paused. "Because the safest place to expose a broken system is from inside it." 3 months later, the official report labeled the incident as an internal corruption exposure event. Security upgrades were implemented nationwide. Marcus Holloway remained behind bars. But here's the part that still keeps investigators awake. 6 weeks after his transfer to Colorado, An anonymous data leak surfaced online. Thousands of internal federal financial records, implicating officials in 5 different states. The source was untraceable, and timestamped at 3:59 a.m., the exact minute the Leavenworth cameras had first gone dark. Authorities insist Holloway had no access to outside communication. They insist the system is secure. But if you've learned anything from this case, it's this. Sometimes the prison isn't the walls. It's the silence around them. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one.